So now that I have my boxes, I could start putting them together, and that will form the bulk of the unit. I started this by edge banding the back edge of the plywood, and that's because I'm going to be putting a continuous hinge on these, so I wanted to seal up that edge. I also edge banded the front and back of that longer piece, but the inside of the two thicker cabinets I kept open. They're a little bit smaller than the width of the full opening, so I'll have to put thicker material there. Then to join everything, I just attach these two continuous hinges. I like these because they open and close as one unit. You can use other hardware, but I didn't want to have hardware on the inside of the cabinet. It would get in the way with all the stuff I was putting in there. And these are relatively inexpensive for what they are. So they'll be outside, out of the way. Now on the bottom, in order to open and close this, I wanted some feet. So I bought these little bearing wheels, but they were smaller than they looked online, which I know is a common problem with ordering stuff online. So for this back unit that will stay stationary, I ended up getting those plastic feet movers, and I countersunk them because I didn't want this to be lifted up off the ground. These are the little wheel ball bearings I got that were just too small for the whole thing. In hindsight, and I didn't order all this stuff, like I said, my sister bought all of the added on stuff as her portion of the present. I would have just used those plastic feet movers for the whole thing. They work great instead of spending the time on these little ball bearings. These were obviously thicker, so I had to countersink them much more. And like I said, the reason I did this was I didn't want to create a big lip that could be tripped on when this is open. So this cabinet rides pretty close to the ground. So once I had those attached, and I cleaned those up a little bit towards the end before I paint, I can now work on this as a full unit. So that's how they open up. I found it was easier to work on the two edges, the two side cabinets with it apart, so that's why I waited to attach them until now. But when I start on the back especially, I need them attached for clearance purposes. So to finish up this one wing, I'm going to be adding some shelves up top, and once again I made sure I had enough clearance to lift the hangers on and off that coat rack, and then I could take measurements and make that shelf. So this is just going to be a standard shelf. I'm making it out of 1/2-inch plywood. I took all of the measurements for the opening. I could cut down my pieces. The way I make these for customers' furniture is with rabbets and dados, so I'm going to do the same thing here. It just makes it a little bit sturdier. So that is where I lined up for my two edge rabbets and then my middle dado. I used the stop on my radial arm saw, the dado stack in there, and I could just cut these rabbets. And then I'll cut the shelves as well. Now, a lot of children's furniture, I'm specifically thinking of stuff like Melissa and Doug, they don't bother dealing with the exposed plywood edge. That's something that if you don't want to deal with it, I wouldn't worry about it. I knew I was going to be painting this, which is why I took the time to try and hide the plywood edge, otherwise so you don't see it. But I think there's nothing wrong with clear coating something like this, showing the plies. It is just a piece of furniture that she'll grow out of and most likely get passed down to someone else, potentially someone not in the family. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's an aesthetic choice. So then, like I said, here's my measurements. You could pause them if you're building something quite similar. I cut all these pieces, I measured the depth of my rabbets and dados, and then I could go through and rough out the shelves. I just have this clamped in place. I could slide those shelves in, and that is basically what that is going to look like. Very simple. I countersunk some holes beforehand so I could attach that to the inside of the cabinet, and then I could just use some brads in order to connect all these pieces. This could be a little difficult, especially with those bottom rabbets, because until the brads are in place, they kind of want to pop out of that rabbet. But I was able to wrangle it into place, attach some brads, and then I slid it into the cabinet so it can dry in place. And that is basically what that portion of this is going to look like. That's a very tight fit. Like I said, nothing's permanently attached. That was one of the things when I took it out to paint it, was a little bit of a pain to get it in and out. So at this point, I'm going to start focusing on the back portion of the cabinet, which was arguably the most built out portion. The two sides were fairly simple work. And sometimes I have a tendency to overbuild and overcomplicate things. And I knew I wanted this red carpet feature that could be retracted as well as rolled out, because there's also going to be a desk, so this could be used as a vanity or essentially a red carpet. So I got the brilliant idea to power that mechanism with cranks, because I just think they're interesting and commonly seen in kids' toys. So all I did was, you could see I used the spacer in order to drill a hole. I'm using a 3/4 inch dowel as my driving force for this, so that slides across the whole piece. I used that spacer because I wanted it to be as accurate as possible. If this is off by 1/8 of an inch or so, it's not going to make a big difference. And then I cut out these spacers on the laser so that that one side of the wheel can't pop through the hole. All of that will all be glued together once this is said and done. Then I got this inexpensive red carpet off of Amazon. It's about 5 feet long. And I just drilled some holes into it. I put some blue tape on there so hopefully it didn't fray a lot. And I have 5/16 inch hardware in the shop, so those are the size holes I used. I could transfer those holes onto the dowel and then drill the holes through the dowel. This is a very simple mechanism. It's basically just a retractable crank. I drilled those holes on the drill press because it's going to be easier to get the bolts through if everything's lined up, and then I could put everything back in place. So I could put a spacer on this side as well, so that my mechanism on this side doesn't cause a lot of friction with the edge of the cabinet. I could put my gears in place, and the problem with this was this would work, but these gears, I got a file offline and I had to shrink them, and they just weren't meshing up properly was the main issue. I spent quite a long time on this until I finally decided to scrap it, and I just used a simple crank that was directly connected to the dowel rod, and it just functioned easier. If there's anything I also know about kids, and my nephews were extremely interested in mostly the cranking mechanism of this cabinet, then I didn't have to worry about gears splitting or anything like that. I just completely simplified it. So that's all this is. I just drew up a simple crank. I put a little bit of dowel in there as the handle, and then obviously the hole for attaching to the dowel. And then I just used a countersinking bit in order to put a set screw through this into that dowel so the whole thing stays in place. I used 2 spacers to kind of lift this off. You could see I patched all the holes I made for the gears, and it was funny, something I spent all afternoon messing with ended up working in about 2 seconds with this crank. So for the carpet, there's going to be a oak rod at the end. A lot of this wood that I'm using is scrap, so the fact that it's oak really doesn't hold any water other than the fact that I had a piece that would work. I cut a groove out of the center, so I had this lined up off center for my bit, so I could cut 2 grooves on the left and the right of my center line and then remove the material in the middle, and that gives me a perfectly centered groove. I could slide that on the end of the carpet and countersink some holes from the bottom. I realize this is out of frame. You obviously don't realize that until you're editing footage that the camera's out of frame. And then that is how that attached to the carpet. So you just had something to pull, easily pull that out. Once again, here's all my measurements. So I'm going to cover this whole thing so I could build the vanity on top of it. And I also didn't want this carpet to retract all the way through. So when I made the face for this, obviously there's a slot for the carpet to go through, but I also put these 2 stops on it so that the edges of that oak hit the stops, and then there's a top plate that sits on top of these angle brackets I made on the side, and this is how this whole unit will get covered. So you can see how the 2 edges of the oak will now hit those stops, so it can't disappear completely underneath the cabinet, and the whole thing had to be set back enough in the cabinet so that when it is retracted, there's enough space for that oak bottom. And then this top I just set in place. That will be a removable piece, and that is basically all that was. So now you can see I could pull out that carpet. The crank unfortunately is not in the most convenient spot, but as with most things, this will probably stay retracted the whole time. The only problem I had with it was getting caught on that MDF lift I was building this on top of, so I added a little angled piece of wood down there, and then I had no issues going forward. So as you can see, it can be pulled out, and then the crank will retract it, and it will stop on those pieces I have for it. So that is basically where this is going to stop, because now construction will start on that back portion, and that will be next week.